hope it can. We can modulate it. It's not.
The center control is.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, other ambassadors, professors, distinguished audience. It's a delight to be here. It's as the evening goes on, you find that a lot of the other speakers are taking your points. So I try to think of something original to say from what I originally was going to say. And I thought what's interesting is to look at my personal experience with the UN and with the G20, because in that I think I can illustrate the point that I want to make. I had the good fortune to work for Madeleine Albright when she was our ambassador to the UN. And it was actually a very exciting time in American foreign policy. The Clinton administration came in, and it decided it was going to put a lot of foreign policy at the UN, that we were going to take a multilateral approach. And Madeleine Albright actually had something she had coined a term, it's not used so much anymore, but assertive multilateralism. And the idea was that the concert of nations would act against aggression and would solve a lot of the world's problems. And this was a very, very exciting time at the UN. The press, more press was getting accredited to there. They realized things were happening. And it was a very exciting, heady time because the sense was that the UN could solve a lot of the problems. The problem is, though, with that vision was Bosnia. Originally, the idea was we would go in as a concerted group of nations and stop the Serb aggression in Bosnia. And day after day went by, week after week. There was a lot of the violence continued, and the Security Council went back and forth and couldn't decide what to do. And then finally, the day that most of us can never forget who were there was the day that Srebrenica fell, and the word of the massacres came. The Dutch peacekeepers were unable to prevent it, and the great tragedy that this all was. And at that point, the realization struck everybody who was following what the Security Council was doing, that there was really a limit to what the UN could do. If you had a divided council, it could not operate under those circumstances. And I think it's very important to see that limitation. You can look at the positive things the UN does. I think of the coalition that George Bush, the first George Bush, put together to throw Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. The world was unified in that. You don't just go invade your neighbor and take him over like that. You see what UN Development Program does around the world. You see a lot of UN agencies that are effective and being a place to get together. You see, when I was there, for example, it's a place where the United States and Cuba can speak, something we don't normally do, but we would have talks there. You need somewhere in the world that they all come together, all the countries come together. And I can tell you in those restaurants that are all over the east side around there are a lot of nations that officially don't recognize each other and speak to each other that, funny enough, are finding their way into the same Chinese restaurant and sharing a meal together to discuss things. So the UN has a role, but it has a limited role. And we saw that at Srebrenica, that there was only so far that the UN could go. Fast forward. In 2008, I was working in the Near East Affairs Bureau. I'd recently left Saudi Arabia, where I'd been serving. And as you know, the world economic crisis came in fall of 2008. I was in Washington. Stock markets plummeted. The world went into a crisis. And in foreign policy, we were seeing that this was spreading all around the world. And the question is, how do we act? How does the United States work with countries that are concerned about this? And so what was very interesting is that we were sitting there, and one thing that was very important was that there's representation around the world as well. And the problem is the G8 doesn't do that. It's too narrowly focused. The UN's too sprawling. But suddenly, I remember our assistant secretary came down and said, we got it. It's called the G20. I was like, G20? Tell me about it. Well, it had been an organization that had been formed earlier for some financial reasons. But in this case, it was in a sense revived because suddenly its size was exactly what it was needed. And it wasn't just its size, it was its representation. How do you get Africa, the Middle East, and these other countries represented in the same room with the kind of countries you see in the G8? And suddenly you have the G20 where Saudi Arabia is in there. It can represent the Arab Middle East. You have South Africa, so that Africa could be represented. And as you look around the world, yes, it's arbitrary that it only goes down to 20 countries, but it's just enough to have all these groups join. And that other countries can go to their representative in there and to say their piece. And the G20 generally works on consensus, as a lot of these groups sort of do. And therefore, if you have consensus, it means that everybody's voice gets heard. So the G20 suddenly found itself thrust into the limelight with the economic crisis, and we found that it was actually the right size to carry on the debate, and it had the representation that was needed to debate these issues. So what you find is it obviously can't do the heavy lifting of a Security Council resolution. It can't do a development UNDP, UN Development Program. It's not capable of doing something like that. But when it comes to coordinated economies and looking at economic crises in the world, it's the best forum we have, or one of the best we have. So what I'm saying is I don't think it's a matter of can the G20 become more effective than the UN. If you continue the sentence, you would say at financial management, yeah, they probably can. But as sort of as a political agency, it cannot. So the interesting thing, I think, as we look at these international institutions is saying, what can they do? They're all capable of doing different things. And don't push one into some area it can't go to. But when there is a crisis, find the one that does fit the bill. And in this case, you have the G20 dealing with finances. You have the UN dealing with its select set of issues. And as you see, Ban Ki-moon, he always goes to, since in 2008, he's gone to G20 meetings because he said we are related. But nonetheless, they are very distinct functions. So my answer would be they're two very good organizations for doing certain things. There are other organizations that are in multilateral organizations that are just as good. But one can't replace the other. It just depends on the issue they have to face. Thank you.
You didn't get